Imagine a country on the verge of colossal changes. The air is filled with the spirit of large-scale construction. Giant factories are being built that are meant to change the face of the world. The plans are ambitious, the resources colossal. But where did the currency come from, without which these plans would have remained just a dream? The official version, which we knew from school textbooks, states everything was obtained thanks to collectivization, grain exports, and the selfless labor of the people. But what if a far more sinister, cynical, and shocking truth hides behind this triumphant picture? We often hear about industrialization as the greatest achievement of Soviet power. But have you ever wondered what price it was paid for? A price not mentioned in ceremonial speeches or written in glossy brochures. At the dawn of the 1930s, the Soviet Union stood on the threshold of grandiose transformations aimed at rapid industrialization. The plans were truly titanic, but for their implementation, the main thing was catastrophically lacking: freely convertible currency. In search of a way out of this difficult situation, the Soviet government resorted to a measure that seemed unexpected to many for a socialist system. In 1931, the All-Union Association for Trade with Foreigners was created, better known as Torgsin. Initially, the idea was simple: to provide foreigners in the USSR with the opportunity to purchase scarce goods, from fashionable clothes to photographic equipment, for foreign cash currency. However, life itself quickly made its adjustments. Catastrophic crop failures in 1932 to 1934 resulted in widespread famine, and ordinary food products became a luxury. It was then that Torgsin began its new, more dramatic chapter, becoming an integral part of a new economic reality that could be called business Soviet style. Facing growing famine, a fateful decision was made. Access to Torgsin was open to Soviet citizens as well. The conditions were simple, but no less harsh. Any USSR citizen could hand over their valuables to the state: items made of precious metals, precious stones, jewelry, imperial-era coins, gold ingots, nuggets, and even scrap silver and gold. The only thing forbidden was church utensils, which were considered state property and subject to confiscation. In exchange for the surrendered treasures, so-called bonds were issued, a kind of voucher that gave the right to purchase from special store shelves what had instantly disappeared from ordinary counters and markets: cereals, meat, butter, fish, and other products. Later, bonds were replaced by commodity books with detachable coupons, the quantity of which the seller would tear off with each purchase. The enterprise developed at an incredible speed. If, in its first month of operation, in December 1931, Torgsin accepted only 90 kilograms of gold, then after 6 months its volumes reached 1 ton, and by the end of the year the figures doubled. In 1932 alone, Torgsin purchased valuables from the population totaling 26.8 million rubles. The following year proved even more fruitful for the buyers. Moscow alone replenished the state treasury with 3 tons of gold. However, the real triumph of Torgsin came in 1933, the most famine-stricken year in the country's history. Through Torgsin receiving points, 45 tons of gold entered the treasury, which was comparable to the volume of its industrial production during that period. All acquired items were carefully remelted into ingots and then sent to the international market, bringing in much-needed foreign currency revenues. At a time when the shelves of ordinary stores were empty, Torgsin shops were abundant with goods. According to contemporaries, the prices there corresponded to world prices, and for $15, exchanged for bonds, one could provide oneself with groceries for a month, making purchases at Torgsin. On the black market, one Torgsin bond fetched from 35 to 40 full-value Soviet rubles, which was a very significant amount, considering that a factory worker's salary was about 80 rubles. However, a year later the situation changed. Citizens' piggy banks emptied. There was nothing left to hand over, and Torgsin failed its annual plan. Thus ended this seemingly successful but very ambiguous story. By 1935, the famine had been overcome, and new stores opened, rivaling Torgsin in assortment. As a result, Torgsin's revenue plummeted tenfold. By the time it closed in 1936, Torgsin had acquired valuables from the population totaling about 270 million rubles. Official sources claim that these funds went towards purchasing equipment for new industrial giants. The cost of a large factory, such as the Stalingrad tractor plant or the Gorky automobile plant, ranged from 20 to 40 million rubles. Soviet literature and textbooks for a long time offered a different version of industrialization financing. It was asserted that funds were obtained through the collectivization of agriculture. Supposedly, grain taken from peasants was exported, and the foreign currency earnings were used to purchase machine tools, equipment, and invite foreign specialists to build giants like Magnitka, Uralmash, Gaz, and Kuznetsk-Stroy. This version was politically advantageous for the Soviet government. It allowed them to present millions of famine victims and repression as not the result of incompetent management or violence, but as a forced sacrifice for a great goal: industrialization. However, the reality was different. During the first five-year plan, grain exports accounted for no more than 10% of the total Soviet exports, and grain was often sold below cost. Thus, grain exports not only failed to meet the needs of industrialization, but also depleted the budget, hindering necessary foreign purchases. Funds for the industrialization of the USSR were obtained by all available means. Timber, coal, oil, metal ores were exported. Works of art from the Hermitage and the Tretyakov Gallery were sold, as well as jewelry confiscated from exploiters and former NF men. However, it was Torgsin, an organization that served foreigners and Soviet citizens who had currency valuables, gold, silver, precious stones, antiques, foreign currency, that played a key role in forming the gold and foreign exchange resources spent on industrialization. The role of Torgsin, not only in industrialization but also in the process that can be called the robbery of the Soviet people, became public relatively recently, largely thanks to the research of Elena Alexandrovna Osokina, author of the book Gold for Industrialization, Torgsin. It was after the publication of this book that articles appeared covering this topic, but it still remains little known to a wide range of readers. This article aims to fill this gap by telling about a little-known page of Soviet history to those who are not yet familiar with Osokina's work. Torgsin is important for understanding Soviet history, demonstrating the methods by which the Soviet government obtained funds for industrialization, a process that many still consider the greatest achievement of the Bolsheviks. Industrialization itself, that is, the construction of a giant military-industrial complex, was carried out mainly by kulak peasants and those who were forced to leave their native villages due to the horrors of collectivization. Russian engineers, many of whom died during the Civil War or emigrated, made a significant contribution to the development of Western countries, especially the USA. The same engineers who remained in the USSR and were loyal to the Soviet government were often distrusted, called bourgeois specialists, and subjected to repression, as for example during the Shakti case or the Industrial Party case. Factories built before the revolution capable of producing modern equipment were in a deplorable state and could not meet the needs of industrialization with domestic machine tools. To implement the grandiose plans, currency was required, and in huge quantities. The low professional and moral level of Soviet managers led to corruption and calculation errors. Foreign suppliers were often paid 2 or 3 times more than the market value. To replenish foreign exchange reserves on July 18, 1930, an office for trading with foreigners, Torgsin, opened in Moscow. Soon, Torgsin stores appeared in all major cities, especially in ports. Here, foreigners could purchase scarce goods for foreign currency, expensive food products, high-quality clothing and shoes, furs, perfumes. Mikhail Bulgakov, in his novel The Master and Margarita, vividly described one such department store in Moscow. Hundreds of pieces of chintz in the richest colors were visible in the shelf cells. Behind them piled up calico and chiffon and frock coat cloth. Whole stacks of shoe boxes stretched into the distance, and several women sat on low stools, their right foot in an old, worn slipper, and their left in a new, sparkling pump, with which they anxiously tapped on the carpet. Somewhere deep around the corner, gramophones sang and played. However, the number of foreigners coming to the USSR was small, and from January 1931, Torgsin opened its doors to Soviet citizens. They were allowed to buy goods for foreign currency, imperial gold chervonnets, and soon in exchange for jewelry, gold, silver, platinum, precious stones, and works of art. In those years, many Soviet families received money transfers from relatives who had emigrated abroad. Until 1931, the Soviet authorities took half of the money sent and exchanged the rest for rubles at an extortionate rate. After the appearance of Torgzin, the authorities allowed citizens to receive foreign currency from abroad. Moreover, the OGPU began actively arresting citizens who had relatives abroad, forcing them to ask emigrants to send dollars, marks, or pounds sterling, and often kept them under arrest until the coveted parcels were received. Initially, Torgzin was supposed to attract not only foreigners, but also the so-called former, surviving nobles, bourgeois, landowners, and under-kulakized inept men, who might have kept remnants of jewelry and imperial coins. However, the number of such people was small, and their savings by that time had already been significantly depleted by the Chekists, starting from 1918, and emigrants facing the Great Depression in the West themselves were in need, and few maintained contact with relatives behind the Iron Curtain. Thus, Torgzin could have remained a small organization that did not play a significant role in the country's history, but everything changed with the onset of the terrible famine of 1932-33. Torgzin offices began to appear throughout the country, like flies over a dying man, even in small district centers. Their clients were peasants exhausted by hunger. Viktor Astafyev, who grew up in the village of Ovsyanka on the Yenisei, described this horror in his story, The Guardian Angel. In 33, our village was crushed by famine. Songs fell silent, weddings and festivities ceased, dogs quieted down. There were no more pigeons. Noisy bands of children did not pour down the ravine on sleds. Cattle in the yards bellowed under the knife. Horses began to fall in the streets. That year, precisely that year, men and women with bundles, horseless and hungry, appeared on the winter road, carrying their belongings in gold, whoever had it, for exchange, to Torgzin. He recalls how in his grandmother's wrinkled dark palm, like a flower, golden earrings glowed. Your deceased mother's. Grandmother moved her parched lips. All that's left. She earned them herself for her wedding. She turned lime mortar with Leonti all winter long. She only wore them on holidays. She was thrifty, respectful. Grandmother fell silent, lost in thought, but her hand was still extended, and in the wrinkles, in the cracks of her palm, the round earrings gleamed joyfully. Touching them, hearing a tinkle, Grandmother instantly clasped her hand. I wanted to save them for you, a memory of your mother. But a black day has come. These golden earrings, the only valuable possession of the Astafyev peasant family, saved them from starvation. In that terrible year alone, Torgzin received 45 tons of pure gold and almost 1.5 tons of silver. In return, the peasants received 235,000 tons of flour, 65,000 tons of groats and rice, and 25,000 tons of sugar. The cheapest rye flour was in the highest demand. This was far from the chintzes of the richest colors from Moscow's Torgzin department store 2 years earlier. The authorities were not just extorting the last valuables from the starving population. They were doing it with a special, ruthless cynicism. The food that Torgzin sold to fellow citizens was significantly more expensive than similar products sold abroad. And in 1933, prices for bread, meat, and butter were raised twice. By the end of the most famine-stricken year, the Torgzin price for bread exceeded the export price fivefold. It was then that Torgzin became the leading Soviet exporter in terms of foreign currency earnings. The famine-stricken year of 1933 drained the last jewels from the Soviet people. In 1934, the threat of starvation receded, and Torgzin's revenue sharply declined. In an attempt to squeeze the last gold and diamonds from the people, the Soviet government began to offer apartments, dachas, and sanatorium vouchers through Torgzin. But the working people had no more gold left. In 1936, Torgzin was closed. During its existence, it brought the Bolsheviks an amount equivalent to 222 tons of pure gold, approximately 300 million gold rubles, or $150 million at 1930 prices. This amount accounted for about 20% of the funds spent on industrialization, enough to build giants like Magnitka, Uralmash, Dniproges, and Kuznetsk. The history of Torgzin is not only a story of cruel extortion of funds from a peasantry dying of hunger, but also a story of the installation of immorality. Torgzin employees stole and speculated, profiting from the people's grief. The logic was simple. If the authorities profit, why shouldn't their loyal servants? The total theft and speculation were well known to the police and the OGPU-NKVD, but they remained inactive, partly because many organ employees themselves were in on it, partly because they understood. Attempts to bring order to Torgzin were doomed to failure, because new employees hired instead of those fired or arrested would behave in exactly the same way. The Soviet system, in essence, could reproduce nothing else. Around Torgzin, the first generation of Soviet underground factory workers also formed. Illegal goods were produced at enterprises, in sheds and basements, which were then supplied to Torgzin stores under false documents. The profits were shared between its employees and the underground factory workers, creating a closed system of corruption and a shadow economy, which became one of the many dark legacies of that time.